Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Wednesday webinar series. Tonight, we have a special session with all of you. We have the ADA and employment, understanding your rights, and we're doing that tonight with our own Bill Murphy. We have been so blessed to have him be part of Epilepsy Foundation New England for so many years. And I'm happy to introduce him tonight. I've had the pleasure of working with Bill now for over 10 years, right, Bill? 10, 11, 12 years. And I've had the pleasure of knowing him for that long. So, and I also consider him a very good friend. So I'm excited to introduce him to all of you tonight. Bill's worked in the field of disability for over 45 years. He started his career actually as a special education teacher. And in 1980, he became a founding member and the executive director of what we've called now the Epilepsy Association of Greater Boston, and is now the Epilepsy Foundation New England. In 2005, Bill went to work for the National Epilepsy Foundation as the Director of State Government and Relations. And then he retired in 2013, but that didn't last long. In 2014, he came back and he is now serving as the Director of Advocacy and Public Policy for Epilepsy Foundation New England. And Bill is a very huge push of our seizure safe school bills for all of our states. And he also heads up the Epilepsy Envoy, which is a group of individuals. And I'm sure he can talk a little bit about that program too. So if you're interested in joining, we'd love to have you. So with no further ado, Bill, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Christine. Thanks,
You're
Amy,
welcome.
inviting me. As Christine said, my name is Bill Murphy, Director of Advocacy and Public Policy at the Epilepsy Foundation New England. I know we have some slides, and hopefully Christine might be able to share those, but I'm going to mix it up a bit. I'm not going to specifically go through the slides in order, and I may go back and review them at the end to make sure I covered all the topics. So, we want to talk about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, disability rights as it applies to employment, and maybe touch on some other areas. It's interesting. We have a legal defense fund down at the national office, and the number one question and concerns that department gets is about employment, and the close second is education. There is, if you want to go to the next slide, please. Okay. That's me. Next slide. That's me again. And the reason I have an X through it is I'm not a lawyer. We at the Epilepsy Foundation do not provide legal assistance. So what I'm saying tonight is, don't bound me by law. It's more in the advocacy area. We're not lawyers. We don't provide medical advice. But hopefully we can advocate in both of those areas about education and employment. Hopefully, I'm going to mix it up a bit. Questions and answers. I think I'm going to sort of ask myself a bunch of questions and then provide the answers. And hopefully it addresses a lot of the concerns and questions that you have. If you have particular questions as we go along, if you want to put it into the chat, and Amy has graciously offered to sort of follow the chat, and if questions come up, she'll direct them to me. So as I said, I'm just going to jump right in by asking myself some questions and answering my own questions, hopefully. And hopefully they answer your questions. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Epilepsy Foundation were leaders, actually, in getting this passed. In fact, the main sponsor of the Americans with Disabilities Act was Tony Coelho. He was the first member of Congress who publicly came out and said that he had epilepsy. And this, we like to say, is Tony's bill. And EFA, as I said, were leaders in pushing this through. It wasn't a short process. It took a few years and a lot of negotiations, but thankfully, President George Bush, the first, signed it. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was amended by the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act many years later in 2008. And actually those amendments strengthened the positions for people living with epilepsy and what we may refer to as hidden disabilities. So that bill in 2008 just added additional protections. And the ADA covers a number of areas, employment being just one of them. And that's called Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that covers employment by private employers with 15 or more employees. So that's a key number to remember. Smaller employers don't necessarily have to comply with the components of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But if employers with 15 or more employees, as well as state and local governments are also required to comply with the provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So how is this act enforced? You can write all that you want, but if there's no enforcement, it really doesn't mean that much. So it's the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That's a lot, EEOC. But they are the ones who enforce the employment provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's important to remember the EEOC because if people do have complaints, that's the agency that investigates folks' complaints about discrimination through the ADA. Now, a lot of states have their own laws. Some are a little bit even stronger than the ADA, but the ADA is the main law that's sort of the umbrella protection for people with disabilities. So we can go back to that first slide, just sort of as a general slide, or even shut the slides off, because as I said, I'm going to sort of jump right in and talk about, okay, when an employer may ask an applicant or an employee questions about their epilepsy, and also how should they act if a candidate volunteers the information and says that they have epilepsy up front. We want to cover what types of reasonable accommodation, what are reasonable accommodations, and what are some that people with epilepsy may need. How an employer should handle information about safety concerns about applicants with epilepsy and employees, and how an employer can ensure that no employee is harassed because of epilepsy or any other disability. So, I guess my first question maybe to myself is, can an employer ask an applicant if they have epilepsy before making a job offer? And the simple answer is no. An employer cannot ask questions about any medical condition or require an applicant to have a medical examination until they make a job offer. This means that an employer cannot ask an applicant questions such whether they have epilepsy or seizures, or whether they use any prescription drugs, or whether they have ever filed for workers' compensation or been injured on the job. Now, of course, an employer may ask questions pertaining to the qualifications for the performance of the job, such as can you drive? So if you're applying to be a UPS driver, that's a basic requirement of the job. So they can ask whether or not a person has a driver's license, or whether or not a person could operate heavy machinery if they're working in a manufacturing plant. So basically, they can't ask you any questions before a job offer is made about any kind of medical conditions unless they are related specifically to the job. Does the ADA require an applicant to disclose that they have epilepsy or some other disability before accepting the job? And again, the answer is no. The ADA does not require applicants to voluntarily disclose that they have epilepsy. So I think the key factor there is they cannot ask about any medical condition, including epilepsy, just simply during the application process or before a job has been made. And again, this does apply to epilepsy. A person with epilepsy, however, voluntarily, this is completely up to the individual, may request an accommodation after becoming an employee, even if that person, when applying for the job, didn't reveal it at the time. They can reveal it once a job offer has been made. So let's can an employer ask any follow-up questions if you voluntarily state that you have epilepsy? And again, the answer is no. The employer must keep any information the applicant discloses about a medical condition completely confidential. So they can't ask follow-up questions if a person reveals that they have epilepsy during the application process, unless that person is going to ask for a reasonable accommodation. Um, so again, after a job offer has been made. And after making a job offer, an employer may ask questions about the applicant's health, including questions about disability, and may require a medical exam. And again, this is an important point to remember, as long as all the applicants, they can't single just the person with epilepsy out to have a medical exam. They would have to require it of all the applicants for that same type of job. I know I'm talking fast here and throwing out a lot of information only because there's a lot of information to go over in this short time. So again, if you have questions or comments, please put it into the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. Okay. What may an employer do when they learn that an applicant has epilepsy after they've been offered the job, but before they start working? There are certain permissible follow-up questions at this stage, and they are different from the pre-offer when an employer may only ask of an applicant if you've revealed that you have epilepsy, whether they need an accommodation. So, and if you disclose that they may not withdraw an offer from an applicant with epilepsy if you're still able to perform the basic functions of that job. Even if you do require a reasonable accommodation. So let's give an example of that. Let's say there's an experienced chef who receives an offer from a hotel resort, and during the after the offer's been made, and during the offer medical examination, he discloses he's had epilepsy for 10 years. When the doctor expresses concern about that, about the applicant's ability to work around stoves or use sharp utensils, the applicant explains that his seizures are medically controlled by medications and offers to bring information from their neurologist to answer the doctor's concerns. You know, he may also point out that there's no evidence that the applicant will pose a significant risk of substantial harm while performing the duties of that job because he's been seizure free for quite some time. The employer cannot then withdraw the job offer. That is pure and blatant discrimination. To say, well, you may have a seizure is like saying that's really speculation. That's like saying somebody may have a heart attack or an accident. So the employer cannot withdraw the job offer. So we'll move on. Okay, questions. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading something else. Something just came through. So when may an employer ask an employee whether epilepsy or some other disability may be causing her performance problem? Only if they really observed performance problems and reasonably believe that the problems are related to the medical condition. However, poor job performance is, if it's unrelated to a medical condition, generally should be handled in accordance with the employer's policies that apply to anyone. I oftentimes encourage folks early on. Most employers of any reasonable size has an employee handbook. We found this to be a useful tool. Get a copy of that handbook. Oftentimes nowadays they're even online, but If problems arise, and we see this often, that the employers speculate and just raise unfounded concerns, um, and they don't follow their own policies. So we've had instances where people have just been fired because they had a seizure. Um, and looking at the employee's handbook, they're like, okay, you didn't follow your own policies about, if something happens on the job. So for that reason, we encourage folks to, again, have copies of the employee's handbook once a job offer has been made. Um, so every once in a while, a person with a disability, or a person with epilepsy, or for any reason, do need to take leave. And if an employer may an employer require an employee on leave because of epilepsy to provide documentation or have a medical examination before allowing her to return to work? And the answer there is yes. Employers do have the right um, to, get a note from your doctor stating it's okay to return to work. However, they can only obtain the information needed to make an assessment of the employee's present ability to perform her job and to do it safely. Um, and again, I'm throwing out a lot of information in short time. So if you have questions about that, let me give an example. A newspaper reporter has been on leave for 4 months following surgery for their epilepsy. And she notifies her employer that although she appears to be seizure free, she will need to have follow-up appointments with her doctor for the next 6 months. And because her job frequently requires her to travel on short notice, the employer may ask her to provide a doctor's note indicating whether she can travel during the next, because that's a basic requirement of the job. If so, whether there are any limits on how long she can be away. So again, the medical information has to be limited to that individual job and what the requirements. Um, are there other instances where an employer may ask an employee with epilepsy about their condition? And again, the answer is yes. Employers also have some rights, and the employer may ask an employee about epilepsy when it has a reasonable belief that the employee will be unable to safely perform the essential functions of the job. And again, essential functions of the job are the basic requirements. And, an employer can ask for information to be certain that the job and the candidate still are a good match. Um, but it's also worth noting that it's important that keeping medical information is confidential. Um, it's with limited exceptions. An employer must keep that information confidential if they know the employee has epilepsy. Under the following circumstances, however, and I said it's oftentimes gets complicated. An employer may disclose that an employee has epilepsy to supervisors and managers to provide a reasonable accommodation or to meet an employee's work restrictions. So if an employee needs, say, extra time to recuperate from a seizure, the employer has the right to let that person's supervisor and managers know why this reasonable accommodation is made. Um, they can also disclose it to first aid and safety personnel if an employee would need an emergency treatment. Or if a complaint has been filed with the EEOC, they can discuss it with those investigating with the ADA or with state and local laws. Um, or where it's needed for workers' compensation or for insurance purposes. For example, to process an insurance claim if a person is going out on leave. So, any questions so far? Good. I'm hoping that the information is clear. All right, so moving on. So Can an employer tell employees who ask why their coworker is allowed to do something that is not permitted, such as, why do they get to take longer breaks or more frequent breaks? Um, an employer cannot share that information with coworkers. Telling coworkers that an employee is receiving a reasonable accommodation amounts to a disclosure that the employee has a disability, and the employer does not have the right to do that. And if an employee then has a seizure at work, can an employer explain to other employees or managers that the employee has epilepsy? And even though people may speculate or identify that these are seizures, the employer cannot explain it because, again, it would be disclosing confidential information. Um, let me give you an example. During a staff meeting, an attorney's arm uh, or someone's arm and leg suddenly starts jerking as part of a seizure. And even though she appears awake and she doesn't say anything, when another employer asks whether he should call an ambulance, a manager can calmly explain, because remember, the managers have a right to know this information, that no first aid is necessary, and they can only assure everyone that the person will be okay in a few minutes. And after the meeting, he stays with that person until she recovers from the surgery. But again, the main point is an employee may now the employee, I'm sorry, the employee, that person or that individual, they may voluntarily to choose her coworkers to tell her coworkers that she has epilepsy. And oftentimes we recommend that if you know you're going to have active seizures on the job, very rarely are you actually dealing directly with HR on a day-to-day basis, or the higher ups on a day-to-day basis. You're most commonly going to be working with your coworkers. And we feel that if you are going to have active seizures on the job, these are the folks, for your own safety and peace of mind, that you may want to disclose your epilepsy to them. Again, it's your own choice. So you can then explain to them what to do if you have a seizure. And this oftentimes we found just from experience that this puts the person with epilepsy and their coworkers much more at ease. Um, but again, that's up to the individual with epilepsy. Um, so, Amy, you had a question?
Yes, where can a person with epilepsy who does not have their seizures under control find remote work? Are there job coaches who can help?
And remote work?
Yeah.
Um, well, I would say the best resource is your state voc rehab program. In Massachusetts, it's called the Mass Rehab Commission, but every state has a vocational rehabilitation commission um, to help with that, and they would be the best starting point. Even if they say, "Oh no, you're not eligible for our services," um, they could redirect you to the sources in your community, and it can vary from state to state and from community to community. Um, but I would say start with your vocational rehabilitation services if you're looking for like job coaching, which is very different. Job coaching is very different from, the job application process and reasonable accommodation. So, does that does that answer your question?
She also asked, hold on, I just lost it for a second. What if they don't have cognitive deficits?
Um,
And this
that
is Lisa. Um, I don't know how to Drancon. If you want to unmute yourself and ask the question too, if you have other parts to that question, you're free to do that.
yeah. Well, having it's important to remember people with epilepsy. Um, Epilepsy covers a wide spectrum. Um, And not everybody with epilepsy has cognitive impairment, and some people do, and some people don't. Obviously, during a seizure, there would be cognitive impairment, but that's in most cases, it would be very short term, actually during the seizure. So, job coaching, and a person could need job coaching for a variety of reasons. Again, there's no one size fits all answer to these kinds of questions. If you're looking and feel you would benefit or need a job coach, again, I would say the starting point would be the your state vocational rehabilitation commission. Certainly, you can contact us as an individual. And hopefully we may have some other resources, but I would say to start the process, go to your state voc rehab commission.
Because her seizures are not controlled at all. And so
I'm sorry?
I said her seizures are not controlled by medication or an RNS at this point. And so she wants to work, but she's afraid to be in an actual job setting. So she would prefer something remote, but it's really hard to find that.
Well,
for someone.
That's a whole separate issue from the ADA. That's just the job market.
Okay.
Finding, I know a lot of people use like online, Indeed, or other job search engines, and you can put in, you could put in different filters. You don't want to see every job throughout the country that's available. You can, with the use of those filters, you can narrow it down to, okay, I'm looking for a job in Massachusetts, in the Boston area, that's remote. So any of these sort of job search engines can help with that. Identifying job openings is very different than, it may be very different from the application process, and it's somewhat like a sequential thing of, how do we find a job, and that's a job market issue
Right.
for people with or without epilepsy. I say, spend some time listing down, okay, what are the job requirements you need? I need to work from home. I need this, or I need that. Many times I'll give another example. Um, this sometimes these things have nothing to do with your epilepsy. I remember working with a woman who was looking for a job, and like many of us, sometimes we've been in job searches or in situations where like, I'll take any job. I just need to find a job. And she brought up the issue of like, I'll take any job. And she was applying for jobs that were starting at 7 o'clock in the morning. And I had to remind her, I'm like, how are you going to take a job that starts at 7 o'clock in the morning when you have two children and the school bus doesn't come till 7:45? So, it's all these different variables. A job search can be very complex. So you need to look at all the variables like, oh, this is the perfect job, but it starts at 7. Okay, well, I have two kids that I have to get off to school, so I can't be there at 7. Well, would this job allow a reasonable accommodation? Could I start at 8 o'clock? So again, I'm using this just as one example to say, the ADA and having epilepsy are huge components to the employment issue, but you also have to look at, okay, what is the job? What are the job requirements? And do I meet these basic requirements? So,
and that's hard too, because when you have somebody who's never been working ever and doesn't have experience, is entry level, basic entry level. In this day and age, as you know, it's even harder to find jobs.
exactly. But then again, remember, you know, like any job applicant, it's a competitive process. But epilepsy is considered a disability under the ADA, and that would also hopefully qualify you for voc rehab services. So there is an additional resource to help you with this process.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay. Okay. So accommodating employees who have epilepsy. The ADA actually requires employers to provide adjustments or modifications, called reasonable accommodations, to enable applicants, again, qualified applicants and employees with disabilities, to have opportunities. Unless doing so, they're required to provide a reasonable accommodation. And the word reasonable is key there, because they're required to provide it, as long as it doesn't provide an undue hardship that is significantly difficult to implement, or great expense. So remember the word reasonable. So you're applying to be the UPS driver. It's not reasonable for an employer to say, okay, you can have the job without driving. So that would not be considered a reasonable accommodation. And again, accommodations vary depending on the needs of the individual and the nature of their epilepsy. And it's also worth noting that the employee, you as the individual living with epilepsy, it's up to you to ask for the reasonable accommodation. And there's a reason for that. We don't want employers to make broad assumptions about all people living with epilepsy. You know what the reasonable accommodation for you may be. And again, because it varies on the needs of the individual. Not all employees with epilepsy will need an accommodation, and they certainly don't require the same accommodations. A lot of the accommodations that a person may need may be extra time to recover following a seizure. They may require some job restructuring, where let's say you're working in a warehouse and your doctor says, I don't want you climbing to great heights. Could that job be restructured that, okay, somebody else would do that high climbing, but you'll pick up part of their job? So, it's not reasonable for them to have to take over your job and you still are on the job without sort of, for lack of a better word, that trade-off. Extra time to recover from a seizure, changing the hours a bit. A person who's on medication, early morning may not be their best time. So would this particular job allow you a later start time and thus working later at the end of the shift? So again, they have to be reasonable accommodations to qualify for that benefit. But some employees may need one or more of breaks to take medication. That would be reasonable. May need to take leave to seek or recuperate from treatment or adjustment to medication. That's a big one. A lot of people will go through medication adjustments, and it may not be the easiest time. So would they be qualified for a leave? A private area to rest after having a seizure, a rubber mat or a carpet in their work area if the person were to fall, to minimize the risk of injury. As I said, adjustments to a work schedule. So those are just examples. You need to give some thought to, okay, what do I, as an individual living with epilepsy, what are the accommodations I need? I don't need extra time to take medication, but I do need a later start time. Now, if I'm a school teacher, it probably wouldn't be a reasonable accommodation to start later because you've got a classroom full of kids. So it depends on the individual and the specifics of that job. So let's say a consistent start time or a schedule change. Example, some people, can request a change from the night shift to the day shift because night shifts it just throws the whole system off. But again, it has to be a reasonable accommodation. A checklist to remember to help with in remembering tasks. That's a very common one. Just having a checklist or instructions in writing is a very reasonable accommodation. Permission to bring a service animal to work if you have a seizure dog. Someone else to drive to meetings and other work-related events. In some cases, permission to work from home, which is well, that's a trend that's somewhat in flux right now, or reassignment to a vacant position. So you're no longer able to perform the functions of this job, but are there other jobs in the company that you are qualified for that you could transfer over to? However, it's important to remember that vacant position must be equivalent in terms of your pay and your status to the original job, or as close as possible, if an equivalent one doesn't exist, but as close as possible. The position doesn't necessarily have to be a promotion, although the employee should be able to compete for any promotions for which they're eligible. And again, there's also a lot of public and private resources to help employers identify what are reasonable accommodations. And when we go back to the slides at some point, I have one of those listed. A resource to help explain how to apply for reasonable accommodation, what some sample accommodations are. So how does an employee with epilepsy, how do you request a reasonable accommodation? There's no magic words that you can use when requesting a reasonable accommodation. You simply have to tell the employer, and again, I would put this in writing, that you need an adjustment or change at work because of your epilepsy. A request for a reasonable accommodation can also come from a family member, a friend, a health professional, or other representative on behalf of the person with epilepsy. Let's give an example. So a teacher tells her principal that she just recently been diagnosed with epilepsy and needs 3 weeks off to find out whether medications will control her seizures. If leave for this length of time or the reason would not be allowed under an existing leave policy, as stated in the employee's handbook, the employer's request for leave is a request for reasonable accommodation. That's an exception. So you have a reasonable accommodation can be an exception to some things that may be listed in the employer's handbook. So can an employer request documentation when you require a reasonable accommodation? And the answer there is yes. But the employer is entitled to documentation to establish, that you have epilepsy and to explain why accommodation is needed. And oftentimes it's your physicians who will write, the need and the reason why an accommodation is needed. However, a request for an employee's entire medical record would be inappropriate, as it's likely would include information about conditions other than the employer's epilepsy. So they can only ask for information that's pertinent to the job that you have. Excuse me. Sorry.
We have another question, Bill.
Okay.
Sarah is asking, I'm sorry, Sam, if you don't need accommodations now, but will later, would waiting until you need accommodations affect your chance of getting accommodations?
Well, if you don't need it, there's no reason to ask for it.
He added, like if your seizures come back or your meds stop working.
Right. That's when you would ask for the reasonable accommodation. when you need the reasonable accommodation. You know, again, we don't want to speculate. You ask for a reasonable accommodation when it's needed, because remember, they have the right to ask for documentation that for the reason and the need for this accommodation, and specifically what that accommodation is that you're asking. So does that answer your question? Hopefully. You know, we don't want to say, well, I may need a reasonable accommodation down the road, because you don't even know what that accommodation may be. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, let me know. Does an employer have to grant every request for a reasonable accommodation? The answer, quite simply, is no. If more than one accommodation would be effective, the employee's preference should be given primary consideration, although the employer is not required to provide the employee's first choice of reasonable accommodation. Again, the key here is reasonable, and you need to be very specific as to what that reasonable accommodation should be. Okay. May an employer be required to provide more than one accommodation for the same employee with epilepsy? The answer there is yes. You know, the duty to provide a reasonable accommodation is an ongoing one. I think the point here, without getting too wonky and into the weeds, is you have a right to this reasonable accommodation. It's required under law. The key to remember is it has to be reasonable. They are required under law to provide that accommodation if you are still able to do the basic functions of the job. A lot of times people are very reluctant to ask for a reasonable accommodation, and we've seen instances where that's happened, and the situation gets worse instead of better. Because they probably needed that reasonable accommodation early on. So you have every right, take back these rights, use these rights. You have every right to request a reasonable accommodation. You know, and I think this is the big topic. Do people have other questions about reasonable accommodations? I mean, I can give you plenty of examples. So, can an employer automatically deny a request for leave because the employer cannot specify, or because the employee, cannot specify an exact date of return? So again, the question I'm asking myself, and people can ask themselves, is, can my employer automatically deny my leave because I can't say for sure when I would return back to work? And the basic answer is no. They can't automatically deny that request for leave because you can't tell them when you come back. Granting leave to an employee who is unable to provide a fixed date of return may be considered a reasonable accommodation. So reasonable accommodation covers a vast area. And we could probably talk about it for a full day seminar, and I'm just giving it to you in sort of a condensed version. So that's why I want to encourage you to ask questions if you have them. I see there's a number of things in the chat. I don't know if they're questions or not.
Those are resources Christine posted and
Yeah.
links.
Okay. Good. So driving. If you are able to drive, if you can drive, let an employer know that early on. If an employee does not have a driver's license because of epilepsy, does an employer have to eliminate driving from the job duties? So driving is a part, like the UPS driver. Obviously, that's a basic component of the job. It wouldn't be reasonable to say, oh, you can have the job, but you don't have to drive. That's not a reasonable accommodation. So does the employer have to eliminate driving from the job responsibilities? And this is a gray area. It depends. And as I said, if driving is an essential part of that job, then the employer does not have to eliminate. However, an employer should carefully consider whether driving actually is an essential job function, or is it a marginal job function, or simply one way of accomplishing an essential function. Let's give an example. A qualified sales clerk applies for a promotion to assistant manager of a store. The employer promotes someone else because it claims that an essential function of the assistant manager's job is driving store receipts to the bank. Okay, they're saying, oh, it's you have to have a driver's license because these receipts have to get to the bank. Because depositing the receipts in a safe and timely manner, not driving, is the actual function of the job. So getting those receipts to the bank is the function of the job, not driving. The employer, in that case, should have determined whether the sales clerk could have done the job with a reasonable compensation. For example, having another employer driver or paying for her to take a taxi. You know, sometimes we don't even think of these solutions, but you know, taking a taxi or these days an Uber would be considered a reasonable accommodation. So again, I know the onus is on you, but think about the functions of the job you're doing or applying for, and the many ways that it could possibly be done. So, I want to wrap up the reasonable accommodation, but I don't want to wrap it up if there's outstanding questions about it. I do want to remind people you have a right to request a reasonable accommodation. So any last minute questions on reasonable accommodations? So a lot of times employers, folks will just say, oh, we're concerned about safety. They hear the word epilepsy and they're concerned about safety. Employers need to be careful about that, not to act on the basis of, you know, myths and fears. There's still a lot of myths and fears and stigma associated with epilepsy, unfortunately. But employers can't rely upon fears and generalizations or stereotypes. They have to evaluate each individual on, you know, their ability to do the job, their skills, their experience. You know, they don't want to lose a good employee. And how having epilepsy may impact that job. So when may an employer refuse to hire or terminate or temporarily restrict the duties of a person because they have safety concerns? No, they can only exclude that individual from a job when the individual poses a direct threat. And by a direct threat, you know, I mean a significant risk of substantial harm to that individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced to a reasonable accommodation. The determination has to be based on, you know, objective, real evidence, including the best medical evidence and advances in the treatment of epilepsy. So, in making a direct threat, if this is a safety concern, you know, the employer has to evaluate the individual's present ability, that individual's ability to do the job. You know, they can also consider, okay, what's the duration of the risk? Is this a major risk, a minimal risk? The nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood that harm would occur. Is a person going to, is it a high risk that this person is going to injure themselves if they have a partial seizure? And plus the imminence of potential harm. You know, I think of the job requirement of climbing to great heights. You know, that could increase the risk of injury for certain individuals. But can that job be restructured to avoid that element of the job and yet the person can continue to perform all the other basic functions of the job through restructuring or job sharing. The harm must be serious and likely to occur, not just speculating like, oh, they have epilepsy. No, they're going to harm themselves. It can't be based on that. And finally, the employer must determine whether any reasonable accommodation, like I said, restructuring the duties or even temporarily reassigning an employer. Let me give another example of that. So a tool inspector with epilepsy applies to be a welder for the same company. He's worked at that company for years. During the past 2 years, the employee has had on several occasions, failed to take their medication and has experienced several seizures at work because they didn't take their medications. Because of the likelihood that the employee would experience sudden and unpredictable seizures and the serious consequences that could happen because of that, if the employee had a seizure while working as a welder, the employer in that case may deny the employee the job. But the key thing to remember there is you have to look at all the factors. And the factors here is this person has not been taking their medications and the increased risk of increased seizures, thus increased harm. So again, doesn't seem to be a simple yes or no answer to many of these variables, but it depends on the nature of that individual's epilepsy, their treatment, their seizure control. So that leads to, can an employer require an employee who's had a seizure at work to submit periodic notes from their doctor indicating that his epilepsy, that their epilepsy is under control? And yes, the employer can, but only if the employer has a reasonable belief that the epilepsy, that the employee's epilepsy will pose a direct threat if he does not see his doctor. Thus, the case of the person not taking their medication and having frequent seizures. So yes, an employer can require periodic notes to say this person is able to perform the basic functions of their job. So I think that covers most of what, or all of what I wanted to cover. But I also wanted to state that all of this information doesn't prevent discrimination from still happening. As I said early on, the most common questions about discrimination that we receive at the Legal Defense Fund are regarding employment, followed second by education. So if you feel strongly that you have been discriminated against, you've gone through all the internal processes that the employer offers or has, making sure that they follow their own procedures. What do you do if you feel you've been discriminated against? So, any person who believes that their employment rights have been violated because of their disability, in this case, because of their epilepsy, and wants to make a claim against the employer, must file a charge of discrimination with the EEOC. Now, a third party may also file a charge on behalf of you or a person with epilepsy who they feel has been experienced discrimination. Let me say, for example, a family member, a social worker, or a representative can file a charge on behalf of someone who is incapacitated because of their epilepsy. There's a time limit to all of this. The charge must be at the EEOC within 180 days from when you feel this incident or discrimination has occurred. The 180-day filing deadline is extended to 300 days if a state or local anti-discrimination agency who has the authority to grant or seek relief as the challenger, or to challenge the unlawful discrimination. So, but I think it's worth bearing in mind, again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not giving legal advice. In many, many instances, you have to decide, do I want to keep this job? Or, I've had it, I'm moving on, I'm getting another job, but I'm not going to allow them to discriminate against me. You have every right to file a complaint with the EEOC. No, but no, I love this job. I want to stay here. I want to keep it. I just need a reasonable accommodation or whatever. This is where I would encourage you to use resources like bulk rehab and the Epilepsy Foundation to learn how to advocate for yourself in an effective way so that you can keep this job. But the choice is always up to you. But if you do file a complaint with the EOC, they'll send all the parties involved a copy of your complaint, and that everybody has an opportunity to respond and provide information. EOC may select the charges for mediation, like, okay, we're going to come in and sit down with everyone and see if we can resolve this situation. But both parties have to agree to that. It can't be just one-sided. Both parties have to agree to mediation. And that can be effective when you want to keep your job. So you both have to agree, which may prevent a time-consuming investigation. So mediation can help shorten the process. Now, remember, again, these can be lengthy processes, and you have to keep in mind, well, can I be out of work for this length of time, not having income coming in? There's practical things to consider also. Do I have another job lined up? Do I have a safety net in place while this process works its way through the process? So that's it in a nutshell. I know I threw out a lot of information. So I think Google, Christine, if we could go back to the slides. I know I got like 3 minutes to zoom through them.
We also have another question, Bill. How about Social Security and work hours?
I'm not sure what you mean, like how much you can work without affecting your Social Security, or are you talking SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance?
Sarah, if you want to unmute yourself, can you go ahead and explain that a little more?
I mean, I'm going to assume you're talking more Social Security disability insurance, and there are rules about how much you can make and still get your Social Security disability. How many hours you can work, again, that varies on the individual. It's not how many hours. I think it's the amount of money that you earn that will determine if your benefits are going to be affected. And again, that's information you should find out beforehand. You don't want to work for months and months and months, and then they come back and say, "Oh, wait a minute, you've earned too much, and you owe, for months and months overpayments." So that's information again that you need to find. I recommend you need to find out before you jump in and say, "Yes, I'll take this job." What are the pluses? What are the minuses? Are you going to lose certain benefits if you take this job? And, we can only speculate. That's why it really is very individualized. Some people it will affect and some people it won't. But, you need to talk to the Social Security Administration and see what impact your going to work would be, whether it be about the hours or the amount of money that you earn. So I'm going to run through these. I think I want to go more towards the end where there's hopefully some resources. The Oh, go back. Sorry. Go back. One more. These are the other areas. We've talked just about ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title I, employment. Um, there's 4 titles. No, wait. 1, 2, 3. Oh, I misnumbered these. There's also protections related to state and local government activities that they have to be open and accessible. Public transportation, as you know, has to be accessible. Public accommodations, and even telecommunications relay services have to be made available under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we just talked about the ADA Title I today. Go through. Yeah, I think we talked about legal rights, disclosing medical information, safety issues, reasonable accommodations. Hopefully we covered that. And these are just areas that hopefully we covered. Legal rights, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the EEOC is the agency that implements and enforces these. Um, Next one, I think this is important to remember. I always say thank heavens for Google. I'm always Googling everything. If you can go back, yeah. Each state under federal law, the generic term is called protection and advocacy organizations. Every state has one. They have different names, but these are resources to also remember. In Maine, it's the Disability Rights Maine, Massachusetts Disability Law Center, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Vermont. Each of the states we serve, and even those states that we don't serve, have a protection and advocacy agency. If you have questions about discrimination or want to file a suit, in addition to EEOC, I would contact your state-based disability law center. Okay, next slide. I think we talked about this. Remember, the more confident disclosing your epilepsy, it's up to you. Next slide. Okay, we covered all of these. Covered that. Remember, your physician can only provide information about your epilepsy as it relates to that job. We've talked about reasonable accommodations. Okay. These, again, are examples of job restructuring, extra breaks, modifying your schedule, assisted devices, changes in the workspace. We just worked with an individual, and it was quite a lengthy process, unfortunately, but it was resolved. And all it required was him being able to wear sunglasses at work, and putting up some partitions to minimize the external stimuli, the lights and the sounds that could have triggered a seizure. Leave can oftentimes be considered a reasonable accommodation. Next, please. Okay. Job Accommodation Network. The JAN, Job Accommodation Network. If you have more questions about accommodations, reasonable accommodations, I think this is a wonderful resource. And we may want to put that in the chat, or and this is just sort of a page from that workbook. Next. I just wanted to highlight, the second most common area of our calls to the legal center is regarding education. And we do have this as a resource, Legal Rights of Children with Epilepsy in School and Daycare, an Advocate's Manual. It's an extensive manual. It's available online, and I just bring it up because I want to point this out as a resource. It's quite lengthy, and what I do when I've shared this with a lot of parents is I'll tell them, look through the index. You're not going to sit down and read a 200-page manual. Look through the index and see what areas of concern you have specifically, and obviously what pages that that information is on. So I wanted to include this just because I think it's a great resource for education. Okay, next. Okay, that's me, how to reach me. And finally, any last questions?
Bill, I have a question. So if I needed accommodations for my job, and what is the process that I would go through? Does my employer come up with my accommodations, or do I come up with my accommodations?
The process actually is quite simple, but I think oftentimes it appears daunting to the individual. It's up to you to request the accommodation. Because if we just said employers have to provide reasonable accommodation, they're going to say, oh, epilepsy, that means seizures, that means falling to the ground. So this is the accommodation. Well, one size does not fit all. It's up to you. You know yourself best. You know your seizures best, and you know your ability to do that job. So it's up to you to request the accommodation. Again, it's confidential between you and your employer, and between you and HR, depending on the size of it. But it's also up to you to be very specific as to what the accommodation is you need. Because you don't want to leave it up to the employer. They could be way off base and say, oh, it's epilepsy, so you must need a soft mat. When what you really need is just a few extra minutes to rest after a seizure. So I know I'm going on and on about that, but the basic answer, Christine, is it's up to you to request it and to be very specific about what you're asking for.
Should you put it in writing?
You always put everything in writing. Yes, you should put it in writing. And in this day and age, most things like that are sent via email. Again, depending on the size of the company. If you're working at a small company, you may want to just write it up and take it into your boss, or if there's an HR department. And remember, this all has to be kept confidential. Put it in writing. One thing I like about emails is you can save all those emails so you get their response also. So anything you do in writing, and also save copies of their response.
Exactly. There's a little saying we like to say is, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So,
And even though, say it's a small informal company, well, they have to have 15 employees or more, and you sit down and have a meeting and they verbally tell you, then you need to request that they put that in writing. Okay. Does that answer your question?
yes, it does. Thank you so much, Bill. I
Okay.
know that that's a question I've been asked, so I wanted to make sure we cover that one. I
Right.
also put in the chat for other people, as Bill's been talking, and I'm going to put the Jan network. I have it right here. I'm going to download it, which I have. The Jan network came up with their own employees with epilepsy or seizure disorders book.
Mhm.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and download this for all of us, and then I will give you guys the link so that you guys can download it too for yourself. I'm going to put it in the chat. So everybody, everything that's been put in the chat tonight, I will make sure that when we follow up with our email tomorrow or Friday with the recording, I'll also include Bill's slides if that's okay. And what I'll do is put all of these resources that we've talked about today in the chat in that email, so you'll have it. I put one in, so if you ever have a chance to go to the Massachusetts disability website, they have a great series of webinars that they do on accommodations, on disability, and then they hold live sessions a lot. So you don't have to be from Massachusetts to take part in these. I love them. I have sent a lot of my clients, people, friends there to get more information about accommodations and how do I work, and they're also great for employers as well. So please, take a minute, excuse me, and go through there and look. And then the Epilepsy Foundation of America, we have an epilepsy learning portal. So there's like these little webinars They actually have a couple different webinars that I posted. One's on what comes next, finding your career path, and then the other one is successful strategies for navigating the workplace as a person with epilepsy. So these webinars are ones that you can take. They're absolutely free. All of the things we posted are free that you can download and take part in. The other thing is if you are having more questions, please reach out to Amy or I or Bill. I will also put his email address in the chat so that you can then copy it and paste it. Please reach out to us. We are happy to guide you either in the right resources or send you along to somebody else that may have more answers for that. But again, thank you so much, Bill, for joining us tonight and sharing your expertise. You are such a gem to have. We are so lucky to have you at
Well,
EFNE.
well, thank you. I know it was a lot of information in a short period of time. And Meg Richardson, I saw your chat, and I think it's a great way to end. What if you have an Italian mom who thinks she knows you better than you? Or is it just me? I did get a laugh when I saw that because mothers know best, they think. So,
She definitely
um,
thinks, trust me.
right. So, but you know yourself best, Meg, and I know you. You're a strong person. So, on that note,
Yeah.
I want to I want to thank everyone, and I'm sorry I kept you over. We went way over.
No, Bill, that's okay. This is important information that we shared tonight, and sometimes it takes longer than that hour.
Yes.
But I will send the recording to everybody. I also want to remind people that if you have not had a chance yet to learn about the Epilepsy Envoy program, Bill Murphy heads that program with his team, and it's a wonderful program. And I'm happy to also put more information in the email that we'll be sending out tomorrow or Friday. So I want to wish everybody a lovely evening. Go ahead, Bill. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to throw in another plug and keep you even longer. I talked about the education issues are second only to employment. In each of the states we serve, we are filing a seizure-safe school bills that would require all school personnel to have seizure recognition and first aid training. So if you'd like to help us with that effort, let me know. We'd like to get it passed this year. So on
Yeah.
that, I promise I'll let everyone go. Good night.
Thanks, Bill. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.